Cara, when Councilmember Pico and I met with you and Mr. Cox right before Christmas to discuss this issue in depth, there was a PowerPoint slide that had an amendment on there that designated quite a bit more funding for stormwater. And that was, of course, appealing to us, or me. And I haven't seen anything about any sort of amendment or transfer of funding to make that area more robust in this proposal.
That idea didn't come from us. I think it was generated through a conversation with Councilman Bennett and others. So that was not our proposal. That was just an example of a modified proposal.
Okay. I do recall that day, though, that you indicated that the mayor was supportive of that amendment and that we could move forward with changes in that funding towards stormwater.
Yes, we were amenable to making some adjustment in those numbers, but certainly not to the extent that we would drop any of the public safety projects or parks projects from that list.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Bennett.
Yeah, Cara. Sorry, forgot to push my button. Cara, you mentioned that you intend to keep in the budget, the general fund, $8 million for pay-as-you-go CIP programs. Do you know what would be in the budget for pay-as-you-go for stormwater? I know next year we have like 24 million or something like that, but I know a lot of that's grants.
Right. I'll have to double check. I know we always have $3 million of maintenance expenditures that we have in our budget, or operating expenditures for the MS4 permit, but I'll have to double check my documents.
Okay, thank you.
What that would be.
Okay. Councilmember Knight.
Carl, back in November when you brought this before us on the work session there, the concern I expressed at that time, and has just been reinforced now, we're going to have a new mayor in 2015. And my concern was doing something now before the new administration, him or her, has a chance to sit down and look at this and make a decision if this is the right way to go. It's a hard question. If we went this to the voters in April, and a new mayor came in either in April and June, depending on a runoff or not, would the voters' decision, if they said, yeah, we do want to do that, would it mandate the new mayor to have to go then issue bonds, or is that just permission if the new administration wanted to do so?
I'm looking at Winetta, but if we get voter authorization, that does not bind us to authorizing the bonds or bind the next mayor to issuing the bonds. It's just getting authorization.
The mayor doesn't issue the bonds, the council issues the bonds.
Right.
So council approval would be required.
And it doesn't bind the council either. It's just authorization.
The only thing I would add, though, is that if this thing is predicated on a list of projects, I think you have a contract with the voter that or an expectation that you're going to accomplish those projects. And the only other concern I would have is that, and Juanetta can correct me, is if council does not put this on the ballot, then we're going to have to wait 2 years for another issue unless council's willing to expend those dollars to have a special election.
So I guess for clarification, it takes council action to actually issue the bonds. I mean, the mayor would bring the recommendation forward, but the city council must approve a bond ordinance. But again, you have to take into consideration, do we have a contract with the city?
That's the dilemma I'm facing. If we don't put it on now, we got to pay $600,000, neighborhood $600,000 to $700,000 if we want to do it on the November 2015 election, because the county is going to charge us that much, or we're going to have to pay $325,000 roughly in that neighborhood to do a special election. So there is a window of opportunity here on the one hand that makes it a good reason to put it on now, but on the other hand, If the new mayor comes in and says, he or she says, I'd rather go strictly with a pay-as-you-go CIP program of what would be 19 million a year, could they come back to council and say, this is an avenue I'd rather not pursue, and not be and neither branch would be obligated to do it. Otherwise, we're going down to a road. We're going down the road that would paint both the new executive administration and council into a corner, based on a campaign done by the current administration.
I would just comment, and I understand that, but it's not unlike maybe SDS. I mean, those projects were designed and approved and continue on through many administrations. So I personally am less concerned about that because I feel strongly that we've vetted these projects through public processes. So you could have somebody come in and I don't see your projects or your priority list changing much. And then my concern is if we wait, is that the infrastructure continues to deteriorate. And you know, obviously council has the authority and probably the duty to figure out where that funding comes for the city to operate. But this is our best proposal with our professional staff that we're putting and asking council to vote on, to put before the voters. So as the clock ticks, the city continues to deteriorate, and that's really the basic issue for us.
Okay, any other questions? I have an alternative proposal that I have passed out to council. I don't know if Gary, if there's wanted to do that. I am concerned about the prioritization of the projects, and I have worked on an alternative proposal to come before council today. And Jill, if you could come back, I'd like to ask you some questions about the reserve funding, and I think there is an alternative to setting aside the money for a reserve and do the moral obligation of the city, as opposed to setting aside money that we don't ever use and we just pay interest on it for 20 years. And so I would like your opinion about whether or not it's necessary to have a reserve fund and we could use a moral obligation of the city for that particular safety net, really, for the investor.
Mm-hmm. So we modeled the numbers, assuming there would be a reserve fund, similarly as the skip bonds were originally issued. And we think that that is sort of the most conservative scenario. But certainly, it's one of the many details I think that you'd want to look carefully at when it comes to issuance of the bonds, is does that reserve fund actually provide enough credit enhancement to lower your cost of borrowing? Because if it doesn't, of course, you don't want to do that. And the whole idea behind a reserve is to provide the investors with more security. Therefore, they are willing to lend you money for less cost, a lower interest rate. And these bonds would have a lot of coverage. There's, over 10 times the amount of revenues as there is debt service. So, that would argue for, saying that the investors are not getting a lot of added security with the reserve fund. So I think we would look at that very carefully. I think there's a good chance that we'd come to the determination that you don't need one. We didn't go down the path of examining that in this. We took a more sort of, conservative point of view, and that's sort of part of the analysis that we're sure the city will ask us to do. If you go ahead and put this to the voters and they authorize that, we'll work on a lot of those details. The second part of your question was, would the moral, place a moral obligation instead? We've never seen a moral obligation used on a sales tax issue, and I don't think in this case it would enhance it. The sales tax issue on its own, based on that pledge of those revenue streams, will be highly rated, and we think will be very appealing to investors. So we don't see how the city having a moral obligation would further enhance what will be a direct pledge of revenues. But definitely looking at whether you could issue it without a reserve, we think is a really good idea and absolutely something to be considered.
Well, if we could lower the amount that we borrow, it dramatically lowers the interest that we have to pay on the issuance, and it would make a significant difference on the repayment of the cost associated with it, so,
It does lower the cost, certainly.
okay. The other issue that I have is not necessarily specifically to afford financing, but it's a prioritization that we have of the allocation, and what I suggest is the allocation is not put together in the right way, that it should be put together as stormwater as being the main allocation and roads, and then we fund those two areas and we do not fund the public safety and the parks with bonds, but we instead take the money that we are saving from the interest that would be not needed to fund the issue of the parks and public safety and use that for cash funding of the other two components. So I just do not think that these four areas are equally important for the infrastructure of the city. So if you take a look at some of the projects that are listed in the packet and take a look at the ones, and I see Karen back there, and sorry, Karen, you probably won't want me to say this, but some of the improvements that I see for the parks area for replacement and some of the tennis court resurfacing, the renovations of the baseball fields, those issues are important issues. I think we need to have those probably done to be able to make those areas playable. But I just do not equate that equal to potholes and the necessity for driving on the streets that we have and fixing up the roads that are necessary to be done in that way. So I would like to prioritize the issue of far as stormwater being the first prioritization, and then allocate the dollars difference. And on your back of the paper I handed out, I reverse the amounts spent on roads and stormwater and allocate 75 million for stormwater and 40 million for roads. I fund the lower priority projects by funding them with cash, which would mean that we would only borrow $115 million as opposed to the 160. The interest on the $115 million at 3.3% for the 20-year period is $42 million. The interest on the 160 is $58.7 million. That's a savings of about $16 million that we could use over the time to fund the other projects, and we would not have to borrow for them, and we would save the money. And I think the issue is if we don't need the moral obligation of the city, that's fine, but I think it maybe would enhance the bonds to go to the mayoral thing. And then I think the other question, and I think Councilmember Knight raised this also, is this something that obligates the new mayor to go into that debt, and is there flexibility for them to go into the debt that is necessary? So I just want to present this as an alternative to have a discussion about. I think that we can prioritize the necessity of stormwater, to me, is a higher prioritization because of the fact that we have, I think in the CH2M Hill, we identified 137 million of high priority projects for that. We also have the PPRTA that puts a lot of money into the roads and the transportation systems. And if you take a look at the current funding of the PPRTA without any enhancement of revenue for maintenance and for the capital construction, that comes up to about 325 million. With this 75 million, that would put it at 400 million. And I think we just need more prioritization for stormwater. So that's my point. That's an alternative suggestion. I don't know if council wants to have a discussion and have some questions that or might come up that we could have a discussion about. So. Okay. All right, any other comments about stormwater and the proposal and where we're at? So, all right. The next item on the agenda